Okay. Welcome to Your Itinerary. My name is Rob Knight, and my guest for this local expert episode is Gary Arndt. Hi, Gary, and thanks for coming back on the show.
Thanks for having me again.
Now, Gary's traveled around the world so much that he could probably be considered a local expert for a lot of places. But I asked him what location he'd like to talk about, and the first thing that popped into his head was Antarctica. He didn't miss a beat. That was the spot that you wanted to talk about. Now, Gary, why Antarctica? Why was that the first spot that came to your mind?
I think for a lot of people, Antarctica is like the place you go when you've been everywhere else. You know, it's the last continent. It's very difficult to get to, and very few people go there. And if you've seen photos, you probably know it's an incredibly beautiful landscape, and you're going to get to see it. It's a photographer's paradise. You could stay up pretty much all day, and when you go, the sun's pretty much up all day, and pretty much be taking pictures nonstop, either of ice or landscapes or the animals you see.
Gotcha. Now, tell me a little bit more about that. Obviously, you've seen the pictures of icebergs and the landscape and that kind of stuff. What sort of wildlife do you expect to see there?
Well, let me back up a second. When we talk about Antarctica, so Antarctica is an entire continent. But if you visit Antarctica, there's a 99% chance of what you're talking about really is the Antarctic Peninsula. So when you look at a map, you'll see a bit of land that juts up and is like an arm going towards the bottom tip of South America, and that's the Antarctic Peninsula. And that's pretty much where everybody goes and pretty much where you want to go. There are other options. So I have a friend right now who's trying to get to the South Pole, and he left via Cape Town. They did a flight. They landed on the ice. They end up flying to the South Pole. It's $80,000, and pretty much you see a white landscape that goes out to infinity. It's not really a photogenic place. So the Antarctic Peninsula is really kind of what we're talking about when we talk about Antarctica. It's the most accessible. It has the best weather, and it also has the most wildlife because it's the warmest and the northernmost point of land in the continent.
I see. Okay, so how do you get there? Where do you fly into to begin your journey to get to Antarctica?
90%, I would say, of everybody that goes to Antarctica will be doing so through Ushuaia, Argentina, which is the southernmost city in the world. So you're probably going to get a flight to Buenos Aires, and then from Buenos Aires you fly down to Ushuaia, which is a pretty small city. I want to say it's maybe 5,000 people during the summer, which is, of course, the North American winter, and it's probably half that number in the winters there when things kind of close down. It's right near Tierra del Fuego National Park in Argentina. So in addition to going to Antarctica, there's tons of photographic opportunities in that region because Tierra del Fuego is just absolutely beautiful. There's mountains and glaciers and just so much to do there that even if for whatever reason you didn't get to go to Antarctica, you could probably still make a pretty good trip out of it.
Nice. And how long of a trip would you expect to take if you're on schedule and you fly there and then you go to Antarctica? What should you spend a week? Should you spend a month? What sort of trip is it?
The shortest trip you're probably going to be able to make by ship is going to be about 6 days. Mm-hmm. And that would be about a day and a half to 2 days going from Ushuaia to Argentina, 2 or 3 days there, and then the same amount of time coming back. So you're looking at 6 or 7 days on the ship, and that's pretty much the minimum. There are some other options. I just talked to a supplier from Chile when I was at World Travel Market. What they do is they fly from Chile to one of the very northernmost islands in the Palmer Peninsula, and then from there you get on a boat and spend some time. So you can cut down your time doing that, but it's a more expensive option. And I should also add the other reason why some people would want to consider flying instead of taking a ship is because the seas from, Cape Horn to the Antarctic Peninsula are some of the worst in the world. It's called the Drake Passage. And you can have experiences where the sailing there is quite nice, or it can be absolutely horrific. So if you do get on the ship, you're going to probably, if you're in any way, shape, or form subject to motion sickness, talk to the ship's doctor. They usually have different types of medication. And I would look into getting a patch that goes behind your ear, kind of like one of those smoker's patches,
Mm-hmm.
but it's actually for motion sickness. Get it as soon as you get on the ship because you want it to start working before the ship leaves, and it's going to take, I don't know, like 6 or 8 hours to get out of the channel to get into the open sea, and that'll give your body an opportunity to start getting the medication inside you.
Wow. So pretty much all the way around, just from what we've talked about so far, this is not a well, I'm going to fly to Antarctica for the weekend kind of a trip. This is a big deal. This is a lot of planning, and a lot goes into this. What so when you're on the ship, you said 6 to 8 hours before you even get into the open sea. Is that basically a 6 or 8 hour boat ride, or are you seeing icebergs and things to photograph even then?
You probably definitely are going to see mountains. Again, it's that Tierra del Fuego region, so sailing out is quite beautiful, and you'll definitely see and you're probably, depending on when the ship leaves, you'll be doing that in the late afternoon, so you may be able to catch sunset, or at least the kind of golden hour light. So yeah, it's going to be reasonably warm at that time, so you can get up on the deck of the ship and take photos, and everyone's also kind of excited because you're going to Antarctica, and everyone is in a really good mood.
I'm sure. I'm sure. So is this something that normally you're going to book pretty far in advance, or are the do the good berths sell out early, or how do you go about organizing your boat transportation?
Yeah, there are only a limited number of ships that go to Antarctica, and if I recall from memory, I think it's around 20 to 25 ships sail to Antarctica every season, and that number goes up and down a couple every season, but that's primarily it. And I think that's around 24,000 people visit Antarctica every year, so that's pretty much it. The company I went with, which full disclosure is also one of my sponsors, G Adventures, they sell out their ship every year for Antarctica, and it's selling out sooner and sooner. So you're definitely going to have to plan ahead, at least 6 months, I would think, if not a little bit more, maybe 9 months or even a full year. So right now we are recording this in December 2014. Probably wouldn't be able to do it in early 2015, so you would want to start thinking about the 2015-2016 season.
Gotcha.
There is an exception to this, however, and I know a couple people that have pulled this off. And what you do is, if you want a discount ticket, and we're looking at maybe 25% off the price of a ticket, and a ticket can go from, I don't know, you're looking at like the $4,000 to $5,000 range for your basic voyage to Antarctica. What you do is you just show up in Ushuaia without a ticket, and you see if there are any ships sailing soon that have an open berth. And usually they want to sell that spot because if they go, they're not making any money off of it. So I know people that have been able to do it for about $3,000. The risk, of course, is you fly all the way down to the southernmost point in the world, and you don't get to go to Antarctica. But like I said before, the upside is there's plenty to do in that region in terms of photography and in terms of visiting natural sites. So it wouldn't be a total bust.
Right. Yeah. So if you were just a real seat of your pants traveler and didn't mind changing plans at the last minute, that might be a good way to save, like you said, a couple grand anyway.
Yeah, and you need to have flexibility with your schedule as well. And the other thing I should point out, so like I said, 6 days I think is about your minimum trip, and I think they can go 9 to 12 days as well, and that's just basically going to the Antarctic Peninsula and back, depending how far down you go and how much time you spend. Most of the tour operators, once or twice a year, will also do a cruise where they visit either the Falkland Islands and or South Georgia Island. And if you look at a map, the Falklands is like due east of Argentina, and South Georgia is a little bit beyond that. And South Georgia is completely uninhabited. I think there's a scientific base there, that's it. And it was where Ernest Shackleton ended up rescuing his crew. He got in a lifeboat, went there, found some whalers, and eventually rescued him. And if you get the opportunity to do that, I highly, highly, highly recommend going to South Georgia Island, because I think it is one of the most fantastic places in the world. You get off. So the way you do landings in the Antarctic or in South Georgia or any of these places is you have these inflatable Zodiac ships. They take about 10 people. You have a Zodiac driver, pulls up on the beach, which is normally rocks, and you kind of get out. You're there until it's time to leave. When you arrive at South Georgia, some of the beaches will have 100,000 penguins on the beach. And you can't see that many animals probably anywhere else in the world. Wow. Maybe the Serengeti migration, maybe migrating caribou up in Alaska, and that's about it. But it's just as far as the eye can see. Penguin, 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 penguin. You know, and they have king penguins, gentoo penguins, chinstap penguins, Adelie penguins, macaroni penguins, rockhopper penguins, you name it. And the penguins have absolutely no fear of humans. There's a significant fur seal population. And the thing you're going to notice, depending on what time of year, so the season goes roughly to November through the end of February. Sometimes in early March you'll see a few cruises. And what you're going to see, the way it's different, is basically what animals have given birth. So if you're going very early in the season, you're going to get to see gigantic elephant seals sparring with each other. The males fight each other for the females to create a harem, and these are really big animals. We're talking like 2,000 pounds, very, very large animals, and they just get massively bloody, and it's Discovery Channel type stuff in full effect. A little later in the year, you're going to start to see the king penguins in places like South Georgia. They have their chicks. The chicks were still fledging. When I was there, I went in January 2012. You're going to see a lot of fur seal pups as well, which are just incredibly cute. And if you go later in the year, most of them will probably have, they may have fledged at that point, and some of them may have gone out to sea already. So that's what you're really going to see at different times of the season when you go to Antarctica.
Interesting. So if you had to pick one particular season to recommend, what would you say? In other words,
I did it in January and I really liked it, but next time, and I almost certainly will go again, I'm going to try to do it earlier just so I can see those elephant seals sparring, because I've seen some of the photos and it's absolutely amazing.
Sure. That'd be a great opportunity to shoot some video too with the,
yeah.
Video-enabled DSLR or mirrorless, whatever. Cool. So, as far as lodging, you're basically sleeping on the ship. Is that right?
Yes. There are no hotels. You may have the option of camping out one night. I know a lot of ships do that, so they have tents and sleeping bags, and so you can say that you slept in Antarctica. But that's pretty much your only option. You're going to be on the ship, and there's an organization called IATA, which is the International Association of Antarctic Tour Operators, and they have a series of guidelines in terms of how they behave when they're there. And so what you can do and how many people can be off the ship at any given one time, there are limits. And so I don't think that would be an option, even if it were something that was doable.
I see. So what are the chances of you getting there on your ship and you want to jump in your Zodiac raft, but there's already too many people there from another ship? Is that a possibility at all, or not really?
It's not, because the ships are in communication with each other. Like I said, there's only a small number of ships. They talk to each other and they say, okay, we're going to this island or we're going to this beach. And so you very rarely see two ships at the same spot at the same time. You may see them passing each other, which we saw a couple ships do that, but they try to avoid landing at the same spot. And the reason they do that is because they don't want to ruin the experience for the people that are there. They don't want too many people on the shore at the same time for environmental reasons. And I think it just takes away from it. So they try to go somewhere else. The trick is there are only so many places in Antarctica you can actually land, because it's primarily, ice and jagged rock. So there's only a couple places you can actually go. So they just need to, they work out their schedules beforehand as to who's going to be where, and so they can time it properly.
That's great. I wish tour operators would do that in other parts of the country or other parts of the world. I've been on, whale watching boats where there's 5, 6 other boats, and even if you get a picture, you're going to have 3 boats in it, and things like that. That's good that they do that to protect the area that they're trying to take people to.
Yeah, the tour operators there, I would say pretty much across the board, are pretty conscientious. I mean, they make their living from going to Antarctica, and the last thing they want to do is ruin it because they understand it's a special place, and just even from a business standpoint, that's how they make their money.
Sure, sure. So, is most of your photography going to be done from the ship, sort of on the way to Antarctica? I mean, like you said, there's not many places to land, and it seems like the opportunities are kind of limited, actually on the continent. So, are most of the shots that you see people get from the ship?
It depends. You will be making about 1 or 2 landings a day, depending on weather and depending on where you happen to be. So when you're doing those landings, you're primarily going to be shooting penguins, seals, the wildlife you see, and whatever you happen to see around you in terms of landscape. Another thing we did a couple times is we just went out in our Zodiacs and we just drove around. So they may find a big chunk of pancake ice, and what we did is we kind of landed our Zodiac on the ice, this floating ice, and then we all got to get out of the Zodiac and stand on it. We did a couple others where we just went around to some icebergs and we saw some penguins jumping off. And we just kind of followed the penguins around. So even though we never technically did a landing, you were off the ship and kind of still exploring the area. So you just need to be prepared for that. For example, on my trip, I rented a 500 millimeter prime lens from Borrow Lenses. So I lugged that along, and it worked great when we did landings. But I didn't take it like on the Zodiac or anything, nor did I use it from the ship. I just had my 18-200 that I had with me for taking those shots.
Gotcha. So something that's a little more flexible, so you're not changing and using the big lens all the time. That makes sense.
Yeah.
But you do think that long glass is definitely important for the landings?
I'm glad I took it, because even though, the rule is you're not supposed to walk up to the penguins, but they often walk up to you because they're curious. There are still things out to a distance that you're going to want to photograph, and you're also going to want to get, the thing to photograph with the birds is behavior. So I was able to get a lot of shots of, like, say, a penguin mother feeding her chick. And for those of you watching on video, it kind of, they feed each other with their beaks kind of like crossed like that, and they regurgitate each other's mouth. That was a really great photo, and you really need to be able to zoom in to get that kind of shot. So yeah, I would, if I go back again, I'm definitely taking a big lens like that.
Great, and I think that's a good tip to just rent it, like you said, from somewhere like Borrow Lenses or Lens Rentals. So, because chances are you don't need, a $14,000, $15,000 500 millimeter lens, unless you're shooting that all the time. Unless what
Right.
you do is shoot wildlife, then absolutely that's worth the investment. But for a once in a lifetime trip like that, then just to rent it makes perfect sense.
And what I also did is, if you have a really big, expensive lens like that, you're also going to have probably a really big tripod that goes with it. And so what I did is I talked to the expedition team on the ship, and I said, look, I got this gigantic lens, and it's kind of a pain in the butt to take it on and off the Zodiac, so I just want to let you know. So if possible, could I either be the first or the last one off the ship, just to give you a little extra time in terms of loading it? Mm-hmm. And they're like, yeah, fine, no problem. And so just being, and there's a good chance that the ship you're on also might have a pro photographer on the ship as well. So you might want to talk with them in terms of, because if they're there for the whole season, and unless it happens to be the very first trip, they may have some ideas as to what to shoot where you're landing, or what to be looking for with certain types of species.
Nice. Now, is it something that you feel like you need a guide for? In other words, is it a place that you would definitely recommend going on a guided tour, or can you just get on the ship and you're kind of going to see the same things?
They're really, the only non-guided option would be to take your own boat to Antarctica. So on the ship, and people do that, so it's not actually a joke. On the ship, you will have, and I'm just speaking from the experience I had on the ship I was on, which was the G Expedition. We had professional naturalists. So we had an ornithologist who was the first guy ever to breed penguins in captivity. He had gone to Antarctica like 25 seasons in a row. We had experts in marine mammalogy. We had geologists. I mean, professional people, and what they do is they spend a season on the ship working. So you're going to not, in addition to just the regular crew that are, say, running the Zodiacs, you have really professional people on the ship, because unlike, going on a celebrity cruise or a Royal Caribbean or something, this is really a learning experience for a lot of people. It's almost like being on a floating seminar. So when you're doing the Great Crossing, or in the evenings a lot of times, what you'll have is lectures by the staff where they'll talk about, okay, here's the animals you're going to be seeing, here's the behavior you'll see, this is what the different sorts of ice we're going to see and how this formed and things like that. So
wow.
Yeah, you'll learn a lot in the process of doing this.
And that's great, because it's one thing to go take pictures of birds, but when somebody can tell you what you're seeing, and you mentioned the behavior, if you understand a little bit about that, I think it really adds to your experience for sure.
Absolutely, and I think that's what makes going to Antarctica different from other sailing excursions you might do, and also other things like, say, going to a safari in Africa, where you're kind of a captive on the ship. So they try to entertain you, and the way they do that is by doing these lectures.
Right. Yeah. I don't think I've ever talked to anybody that went to Africa and ended up having a wildlife biologist in their truck with them while they're shooting. So that's really cool. Wow. What about non-photo related activities? Is there anything else fun to do when you're not shooting?
There are some. First of all, when you're actually in the peninsula, there's ample opportunities on the deck of the ship to take photos. So I think a lot of the shots of glaciers and ice that you're going to see, especially if the sun is very low in the sky, is going to be done from the deck of a ship. And when you're in that passage, there's so if you look at a map, there's like a series of islands and a passage between them and the actual continent. A lot of the ships go in there, so the water is actually pretty smooth. So there's lots of opportunities to do that. The ship I was on, you could go up kayaking if you want. So they had a kayak master. That was something you needed to sign up for before the trip started, but that's an option as well. Doesn't necessarily go well with photography. I don't think you want to be taking an SLR with you on a kayak.
Sure. With your 500 millimeter lens.
Yeah, just isn't going to work. But that's something you can do. And then if your ship stops at Deception Island, there's also an opportunity to go swimming.
Okay, tell me about going swimming in Antarctica.
Yeah, okay, I kind of threw that out there. You're probably thinking, well, you're going to freeze. And that's partially true, but on Deception Island, there's actually a thermal vent that comes up. And so there's this patch where there's hot water. So you can actually go swimming in relatively warm water. And the people who did it, I did not, said you can kind of like bury your hands down in the sand, and if you put them far enough, it's actually so hot you can't really stand it for too long. So that's kind of where most people do swimming if you make a stop on Deception Island.
Gotcha. So it's not, they don't put you in a dry suit and throw you out in the ocean or anything like that. It's actually a warm water place to swim.
Yeah.
That makes more sense.
So you can say you went swimming in Antarctica if you wanted to do it. And I should say Deception Island is the location of an old whaling station. So there's a couple places like that in Antarctica where you will see remnants of the whaling industry from the early 20th century, and that's one of them.
That's cool.
And I should say the other thing you'll see, you'll probably make a couple stops, is that Chile, Argentina, and the UK all have scientific bases in that region. And so you can stop there. They usually have souvenirs for sale, actually. You can send a postcard. So I sent a postcard from Port Lockroy, which is the British base, and it's the southernmost post office in the world, or so they claim. And you can literally say they will postmark it, and they will, I think they fly it from there to the Falkland Islands and then to London, and it takes a really long time to get delivered. But if you want to send a postcard from someone from Antarctica, it's actually possible.
That's funny. Now, with the old whaling stations, is that anything you can tour and look around, like do any sort of like whaling exploration type photography, or is it just something you see from the ship?
No, you can walk around it. On Deception Island, in particular, there are these very large vats that were used for rendering all the whale blubber. Those are still there. Everything is pretty much rusting away at this point, so it's pretty much you're visiting ruins, industrial ruins. And the same is true in a couple of spots. If you visit South Georgia Island, you'll see some abandoned whaling stations. But they're really interesting places and fun to photograph in their own right.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think I've ever seen pictures of that. Of course, I haven't really gone to look, but I certainly will when we get done with this interview. That sounds really cool. Just something besides glaciers and penguins and seals. Sounds like a pretty well-rounded kind of a trip.
It is, and I bet there's a lot of people, if they're interested in travel photography and they're well-traveled, have probably thought about, maybe in the back of their head, man, it would be cool to go to Antarctica one day, but they've never really sat down and planned out, okay, like what's this going to entail? And I think it's definitely worth the time to at least do some research, find out the companies that offer it, get an idea of what the budget is going to be. It's you're with the plane tickets and everything else, you're looking at into the several thousands of dollars. So you should be aware of that kind of up front. But it is possible to get to Ushuaia by bus. I know someone who did it, so you can literally take a bus from Buenos Aires to Ushuaia.
Mm-hmm.
It's a
How long does that take?
It's over a day. I want to say it may even be longer than that, like 36 hours or something. It's a very long bus trip, but it is possible. So there are ways you can reduce your costs. There are some low-budget hotels in Ushuaia. I actually, now that I think about it, didn't even see many high-end hotels when I was there. It is very much a tourist town, and the business there is sending people to Antarctica. And the other thing I should note, most of all the cruise ships that go to Antarctica are going to be around 200 to 400 people on the ship. So we're not talking cruise ships like you see docking in Fort Lauderdale or something like that. However, ships over 500 passengers can go to Antarctica, but they can't land. So it might be possible so you may think, oh, I found a good deal to Antarctica, and it's on a larger ship, maybe for a cruise line. But just be aware that some of those ships don't do any landings. So everything you're going to be seeing is from the deck of the ship. You won't actually be touching the soil, and you won't get up close with a lot of the wildlife.
That's a great tip. Yeah, be sure if you're booking a berth on a ship that the ship is actually going there to stop. That's a great tip. Because some people might not care. Some people would just be happy enough to go there and see it from the deck of the ship. That's
true. And while I'm saying it, I also should probably mention, I think you can fly from either there are flights from Christchurch, New Zealand, and I also think from Melbourne, where you can actually go on a flight scene tour over Antarctica that doesn't land, but it's in I think Qantas does it once a month, where it's like a proper jet aircraft, and you fly over Antarctica. Obviously, that is a much cheaper solution than getting on a boat and spending a week of your time doing that, but you still get to at least to see Antarctica to some extent.
Right, not necessarily a photographer's way to see it, most likely.
No, I mean you're shooting out a window, but
right.
That is an option.
Sure. Well, from everything you're saying, my next question is about taking your family to Antarctica, and that it seems like kind of a no, unless you have older kids and that kind of thing. I'm not planning to take my 3-year-old and my 9-month-old to Antarctica based on what we've talked about.
I think it would be an awful lot of money for something they wouldn't even have any idea what's happening. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wouldn't take anybody unless they're probably teenagers even, where they're big enough not only to appreciate it but be physically fit to, do the landings and things like that.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Great. Well, you mentioned doing research. What are some good resources that you can recommend for people who are planning and wanting to research a trip to Antarctica?
I would just start on Google and go from there. There's a lot of information that's given on the various tour operator websites. So, like I said, I went with G Adventures. On their website, they will give a complete listing of all the different itineraries and options. I think that's the first thing to figure out. What time of year? What is it you want to see? Like I said, I strongly recommend, if you can afford the time and the money to do it, to go to South Georgia Island and the Falklands as part of your trip. So if that's something you'd like to do, research what time, because they do it at different times of the year. They don't kind of all do it at once. The number of people who go to South Georgia, like I said, about 24,000 people I think go to Antarctica a year. I think the number that go to South Georgia is about 2,000.
Oh,
just
wow.
to give you an idea of how few people go there.
Mm-hmm.
And from a photography standpoint, my South Georgia images have done, way better in terms of competitions and on social media than actually my Antarctica photos.
Interesting, because it's something
other than that,
you don't see all the time.
Exactly, and just, so many penguins. I mean, it's just, it almost boggles the mind. And then there's also the historical aspect of being in South Georgia because of Shackleton. You actually can do the hike. It's like a 3-hour hike where you do the last bit that he hiked, where he found the whaling station. He did it with snow. You get to do it, when there's no snow on the ground. Shackleton is buried there at Grytviken, which is the quote-unquote capital of South Georgia, even though nobody really lives there. I think there's just a caretaker staff that's there in the summers. And you can see there's also an old whaling station there as well, so you can visit the facilities, and they have a small museum and a chapel and things like that.
Cool. And it seems like if you're going to the trouble to get all the way down there, then you'd want to take advantage of every opportunity you can. So, and if you don't know who Shackleton is before you go to Antarctica, you definitely have to read up on that. That's a fascinating story.
And you were mentioning research. I think a good one would be to watch Frozen Planet. That was the BBC documentary that came out, I think, in 2011 with David Attenborough, and it's great. It deals with both polar regions, both Antarctica and the Arctic, but it'll give you lots of inspiration. And the one thing I should note, there was a National Geographic documentary that came out a few years ago. I think it was The March of the Penguins. You're probably not going to see emperor penguins, because emperor penguins live inland, not necessarily on the peninsula. You'll see pretty much every other type of penguin that you can think of, except for maybe fairy penguins, Galapagos penguins, and things like that. Mm-hmm. But you won't see emperor penguins. If you go to South Georgia, you will definitely see king penguins, which are almost as big as emperor penguins, but just a little bit shorter. Because a lot of people think they're going to see these emperor penguins when they go, but that's actually just not the right place for them.
I see. Good to know. And I think with anywhere, the more you know about where you're going, especially with something like that, with like Antarctica, the more you know about the wildlife and the landscape and the history of it, the more you'll get out of that trip. So, well, Gary, thanks a lot for being a local expert on Antarctica, and hopefully I can talk you into coming on and talking about one of the other 50 million places that you've been and giving us tips for that too.
I think I can find one to talk about.
Great. Well, if you like what you hear on your itinerary, please tell all your friends about it and stop by iTunes and leave us a couple of stars and some positive feedback. And thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.